When we look back at the Great Hunger, or the Great Famine, as the majority of people know it, we usually focus on the numbers. We look at the statistics of emigration, the political failures, and the terrible death tolls. We treat it as a history of economics and survival. But there is a different history that often gets overlooked. It is the history of what happened to the sound of Ireland. What did Ireland sound like before the famine years? What was it like to walk around one of those busy townlands? What instruments did you hear? What songs were sung? So stick around because you'll definitely get a different view on what life was like during the Great Hunger. Before 1845, the Irish countryside was loud. It was filled with music, weddings and gatherings at the heart. But within a few short years, travellers and survivors began to report a terrifying new reality, the Great Silence. This was a name given to how the people back then avoided any expression of culture. This includes language, music and art, for example. But you'll learn an awful lot about this Great Silence later on in the video. Many people think it's a myth, but many people believe it was real as well. But it'll all make sense later on. This silence changed everything. The music didn't simply pause until the food came back. The tradition was completely shattered. The pipers and fiddlers died, or boarded ships and died. Not all made it to their destination. The Irish language faded, taking the old songs with it. And for those who stayed behind, music became a painful reminder of the past, a symbol of poverty and shame that they wanted to forget. While Ireland fell silent, the music found a new home. It crossed the Atlantic and settled in the loud, busy streets of places like Chicago. To understand Irish music today, we have to understand this moment where music fled its homeland to survive. So what was life like in Ireland before all of this? To really feel the weight of this silence that we're talking about, that arrived in 1845, we need to step back and listen to the sheer volume of noise in Ireland before the famine. In the early 1800s, the country was absolutely packed. The population had swelled to over 8 million people, and this had fallen to around 4 million people at its lowest. And still to this day, at around 7 million people on the island, it still hasn't passed its peak of pre-famine years. The landscape to the west and the south was far from quiet. Empty fields that we might see today, it was completely teeming with life. Most people lived in settlements called clachans. These were tight clusters of farmhouses, almost like tiny villages without streets. Because families lived so close to one another, life was intensely communal. You couldn't be isolated even if you wanted to be. In these communities, music served a very specific purpose. It wasn't a formal performance where you sat quietly and listened or watched like in a concert hall. It was more like a tool for living, fuel for social gatherings, courtship and religion days. The music lived in three main places. It was in the cramped kitchens during house dances, it was out in the open air at the crossroad dances, and perhaps most importantly, it was found at the Pattern Days. These were massive, noisy festivals held to celebrate a local patron saint. The absolute peak of the year for these communities was the Pattern Day. Originally, these were meant to be holy days, serious pilgrimages to a holy well or to a site connected to a local saint. But by the early 1800s, they had evolved into something much louder. They became massive, chaotic festivals where religion and partying happened more or less side by side. We have a vivid window into this world thanks to a school teacher and diarist from County Kilkenny named Humphrey O'Sullivan. In the late 1820s, he wrote down exactly what he saw. He described a calendar punctuated not just by work, but by feast days that were fueled by music and consumption. At a pattern, you would see tents set up for drinking and dancing, right next to the Holy Well itself. This is where musicians became the true engine of the festival. Pipers and fiddlers would set themselves up along the pilgrimage route or inside whiskey tents, playing for hours on end. The atmosphere was intense. One observer famously described the crowds as having bloody knees from devotion and bloody heads from fighting. And this fighting wasn't accidental. It was a tradition known as the faction fight. Rival families or parishes would engage in organised, ritualised brawls for territory or prestige even. While the church and state eventually crushed these gatherings, to bring about order. In the years before the famine, these chaotic, violent musical days were the loudest expression of Irish culture. While the pattern days were the chaotic highlight of the year, the day-to-day music lived in the home. Because families lived so tightly packed in those clachans, the kitchen became their main stage. They called this the house dance. It was often spur of the moment. You didn't need a full band or a planned event. You just needed one musician. It might be a fiddler, a piper, or if no instrument was even available, a lilter. Somebody who could mimic the fast rhythm of the tunes just by using their voice. Then there was the music of death. The merry wake was a central part of life before the famine. Unlike the quiet, somber funerals that became the norm later in the century, these pre-famine wakes were loud and full of energy. They included games and storytelling and music, all designed to comfort the grieving family and celebrate the life of the person who had passed. The sound of a wake was unique because it mixed two very different things. On one hand, you had lively dance tunes played to keep the watchers awake throughout the long night. On the other hand, the cuinu, or keening, and this was a specific haunting lament performed by mourning women. It was an expression of grief, and as we will see, this specific sound as well, the keen or the cuinu, would become one of the first and most tragic casualties of the Great Silence. If you have a look at the breakdown on screen, you can see how the music world was divided before 1845. It wasn't about who could play the best. It was about who had the safety net to survive. At the very top, you have the gentlemen pipers. These were wealthy landlords. They played the pipes for fun. Because they had the money and land, they were safe. When the crops failed, their music continued behind closed doors. Below them, you see the working class of the music world, the professional pipers and the dancing masters. These men were respected professionals with a trade. They travelled around teaching steps or playing at fairs. But they had a major weakness. Their income came entirely from the spare cash of the farming families. As soon as the hunger started, dance lessons became an impossible luxury. Their business essentially collapsed overnight. But the most critical group is at the bottom. This is where the tragedy hits the hardest, the blind pipers. In pre-famine Ireland, blindness was common, often caused by smallpox. Since these men couldn't work the fields, music was one of the only jobs open to them. Men like the famous Paddy Coneely, the Galway Piper as he was known, were not beggars. They were celebrated artists and essentially walking libraries of tunes. They were the archivists of the tradition. They carried hundreds of years of history and tunes in their heads, but they were totally dependent on the community for a meal and a bed. They needed a guide to help them travel and a neighbour to feed them. As the chart shows, their vulnerability was critical. When the community that fed them began to starve, the support system for these people simply evaporated. It's not that hard also to imagine now what this meant for the music tradition. It was absolutely at risk with what was to come. Let's talk a little bit more about the silence, the Great Silence. But let's first talk about what did Ireland sound like. Travellers and writers from the time often commented on just how loud Ireland was. This was a society that lived outdoors and lived at full volume. An American traveller named Asenath Nicholson walked through Ireland right before the famine, and she described a landscape that was never quiet. It was filled with the sounds of a massive population. You would hear the shouting of cattle drovers at the fairs, the rhythmic working songs of labourers in the fields, and the constant rapid-fire sound of the Irish language being spoken everywhere. William Carleton, a writer who grew up in this world, captured it perfectly in his book Traits and Stories of the Irish Peasantry. He described a world where the hedge school and dancing master weren't just hobbies, and being able to dance a jig or a reel wasn't just for fun. They were vital parts of life and basic social skills that everyone was expected to have. The countryside was densely packed and incredibly noisy, and that is what makes the history of the next few years so haunting. On the grand timescale of things, it wasn't a gradual quiet. It was a sudden mute button pressed on a vibrant, loud, musical nation. The Great Silence wasn't just a metaphor that we're using, it was the direct result of a brutal economic collapse that dismantled the world where Irish music lived. When the potato blight struck in 1845, 1846, and again in 1848, it triggered a chain reaction that specifically targeted the people who carried the music. Musicians, especially the travelling pipers and dancing masters, were like the canaries in the coal mine. They were the first to feel the disaster. Before the famine, even the poorest families usually had a spare penny to pay the piper, or a fee for the dancing master. But when the crops failed, that money evaporated instantly. Music was a trade, and suddenly the customers were starving. We can see this tragedy in a phrase that was recorded years later, stating, "The pipers were gone out of fashion." On the surface it sounds like people just changed their tastes. But this was a dark euphemism. The reality was that the people were simply too hungry to sustain them. The economy that kept the music alive had collapsed. One of the most heartbreaking pieces of evidence from this time comes from the pawn shops. As families became desperate, they began to sell everything they owned. They did this to buy passage on a ship, or to buy what was known as Indian meal. This was a yellow corn maize imported from America to replace the lost potatoes. It was coarse, incredibly difficult to cook, and hated by the people. But for many, this hard yellow meal was the only food to keep them alive. To buy it, the music had to go. Reports from Dublin, Cork and Limerick describe pawn shop windows that were literally filled with mountains of fiddles and flutes. There were so many instruments flooding the market at once that their value crashed. You could pick up a high-quality instrument for pennies. We have to remember that a set of uilleann pipes or a fiddle was often a family heirloom, passed down through generations. Handing it over to a pawnbroker was a final act of desperation. It meant choosing survival over history. Many of these instruments were never brought back. Instead, a grim trade developed. Dealers from London, known as music duffers, bought these instruments in bulk. They took them back to England, stained the wood to look more ancient, and sold them as curiosities to British collectors. The physical tools of Irish culture were essentially being sold off for a bag of corn, disguised and scattered across the British Empire. For those who lost everything, the only option left was the workhouse. This was the institution of last resort. It was a prison for the destitute, and for Irish music, it became a tomb. The very structure of the workhouse was designed to destroy the way culture was passed down. The moment a family entered the gates, they were split up. Men went to one yard and women went to another, and children were taken away from their parents. This rule shattered the teaching of music. Tunes were usually learned in the home, passed from father to son, or mother to daughter. The workhouse physically severed that link. Inside, the atmosphere was strict and silent. Music, dancing, and loud noise were forbidden. The chaotic joy of the village was replaced by the enforced silence of the dormitory. This is where the blind pipers we discussed earlier met their end. As their patrons died or emigrated, these musicians had no one left to feed them. Workhouse records from towns like Skibbereen or Ballinasloe list musicians, pipers and ballad singers among the inmates. We even know some of their names. John MacDonagh was known as the Peerless Piper. A contemporary account describes him being crushed between poverty and decrepitude before he died destitute on the road. Then there was Garrett Barry. He was a legend in County Clare, a man whose style is still studied today, yet he ended his days inside the Ennistimon workhouse. Roughly 1 million people died during these years, but another million fled the country, and this mass exodus created a specific kind of silence. The people most likely to survive the journey to the ports and get on a ship were the young and strong. This hollowed out the population. It stripped away the middle generation, the active musicians, and the primary dancers. Ireland was left with a population of the very old and the very young. Even for those who made it onto the boats, the music often died at sea. They were called coffin ships for a reason. The conditions in steerage were horrific. In the chaos, fragile wooden instruments like fiddles were often left on the dock, crushed in the hold, or traded for food. And for the humans surviving in those fever-ridden decks, the will to play vanished. A fever ship was no place for a jig. But back home, another tragedy unfolded. The famine killed the audience as effectively as it killed the musician. A piper needs a purpose. He needs a wedding, a fair, or a crowded kitchen to make the music live. With the countryside depopulated, and the survivors traumatized. Those gatherings simply stopped. The musician survived, but his role in society disappeared. So let's look at the full picture of what's happened in these few short years. The famine physically removed the musicians through death and the workhouse. It destroyed the instruments in the pawn shops. And finally, it broke the psychological link to the culture. The survivors faced a brutal choice: hold on to the Irish language and the old ways, or embrace English to survive in America. They chose survival, and the price of that survival was the silence of their own history. For those who survived the hunger, the silence came from within. Post-famine Ireland was a deeply traumatized society. When people looked back at the years before the famine, the wild pattern days, the drinking, and the loud music, they didn't feel nostalgia, they felt shame. A dark belief took hold in the minds of the people. Many began to believe that the famine was a divine punishment sent by God to punish them for the excesses and wild behaviour of the past. This particular belief was stated by Charles Trevelyan, essentially the architect behind the famine. He stated that the famine was the judgment of God sent to teach the Irish a lesson. In this new mindset, music became a sin. To dance was to disrespect the dead. The music, which had been the soundtrack of their lives, became a painful reminder of a lost world. Survivors refused to talk about the past, and they certainly refused to sing about it. Playing a cheerful jig or a reel felt wrong in a landscape that was scarred by mass graves. Just as the worst of the Great Hunger began to fade in 1850, a new force arrived to enforce this silence: the Catholic Church. Under the leadership of a new, strict leader named Cardinal Paul Cullen, the Catholic Church launched a campaign to clean up Ireland. They wanted to align the Irish people with strict Roman discipline and Victorian morality. This officially began at a massive meeting known as the Synod of Thurles in 1850. At this meeting, the church hierarchy explicitly condemned the abuses of the old ways. They targeted the pattern days and the wakes, labelling them as pagan, unruly and shameful. The goal was to move religion indoors. They took the practice of faith away from the chaotic, music-filled holy wells and crossroads and locked it inside the controlled, silent walls of the chapel. The house dance and the crossroads dance were declared occasions of sin. This led to a direct conflict between the priest and the piper. Oral history is full of stories from this time of priests breaking up house dances, driving musicians away from crossroads, and even smashing instruments. They viewed the unsupervised mixing of men and women at these dances as a moral danger. Even the merry wake was sanitized. It was stripped of its games and music, transformed into the solemn, prayerful event we recognize today. While historians often point to the Public Dance Halls Act of 1935 as the death of the house dance, the seeds were actually sown here in 1850. The church effectively stepped in to finish what the famine had started. To really develop our understanding of what this silence felt like, we need to leave the statistics behind and look at the people who saw it happen. We have 4 witnesses who tell the story best: an outsider, a collector, a priest, and a victim. We start with the outsider, Asenath Nicholson. Nicholson was an American woman who travelled through Ireland twice, once in 1844 and again in 1847. She was different from almost every other traveller of her time. She didn't watch the suffering from the window of a carriage. She walked. She stayed in the cabins of the poor and ate with them. Because she visited twice, her journals give us a perfect before and after picture. In 1844, she found a country full of hospitality, curiosity, and constant noise. But when she returned 3 years later, in the middle of the famine, she found a completely different world. She wrote about a great unwanted silence. She described a country where the children had stopped playing. She used a biblical image to describe the tragedy, saying it felt as if the harp had been hung up on the willows. To her, it felt as though even the birds had stopped singing. Nicholson realized that the silence was physical. Starvation strips a person of the energy to move, to argue, and certainly to sing. She described meeting the living dead, people who simply had no breath left for music. Her accounts were so powerful that they recently inspired the Irish composer Donogh Dennehy to write The Hunger, a modern opera that tries to capture the terrifying sound of that void. Next, we've got George Petrie. He was a famous artist and historian who looked at the devastation around him and realized he was witnessing the end of an era. He didn't see his job as celebrating a living culture. He saw it as a salvage operation for a civilization that was already destroyed. In 1855, he wrote what is perhaps the most famous description of this time. He said, "The land of song was no longer tuneful, or if a human sound met the traveller's ear, it was only that of the feeble and despairing wail for the dead." This awful, unwanted silence struck more fearfully upon their imaginations. Petrie worked with a sense of panic. He knew that the famine had specifically targeted the old Irish families and the blind pipers, the very people who held the music in their heads. He raced to write it down before they and the music disappeared forever. While Petrie observed the silence, Canon James Goodman was living right in the centre of the scream. Goodman was a Church of Ireland clergyman stationed in Skibbereen. If you know the history of the famine already, you know that Skibbereen was ground zero. It was the place where the suffering was most visible, home to the mass grave pits that haunt the history books. But Goodman was also an uilleann piper and a fluent Irish speaker. In the middle of this nightmare, he started a desperate mission. He managed to collect over 2,000 tunes in his manuscripts. The timing of this was incredible. He was often taking tunes from pipers who were on the verge of starvation or about to enter the workhouse. He was essentially capturing their repertoire days or weeks before they died. Because of his urgent work, the music of pre-famine Munster survived in his notes, even as the people who played it perished in the workhouse of Skibbereen. Although the famine didn't kill music entirely, it displaced it. The aftermath is defined by a massive geographical shift. While Ireland fell silent, the music did find a new home in America. It didn't die, it emigrated. By the late 19th century, it was argued that there were more pipers and fiddlers in Chicago than in Dublin. The diaspora became the sanctuary for the tradition. It preserved styles that were rapidly eroding in the homeland due to modernization and shame. The central figure of this preservation is Francis O'Neill. He was born in West Cork during the height of the famine. He emigrated and eventually became the chief of the police in Chicago. O'Neill used his position to employ Irish musicians as police officers. He famously prioritised musical ability over policing experience. His force became a stable environment for the tradition, providing the steady income musicians needed to keep playing. O'Neill collected music from famine survivors who had emigrated. He recognised that immigrant culture often freezes in time. This meant that pre-famine styles were preserved in the United States. And I have here with me as well that collection of tunes. And I'm just literally just after finding one I like the sound of already. Father Dollard's favourite. Yeah, but you can see that the tunes are written down here, and there's also a name in the top right who he got the song off of. I'm just showing the beginning and the opening of the book. To the multitude of non-professional musicians of the Gaelic and English-speaking races all over the world who enjoy and cherish the melodies of Ireland, this work is respectfully dedicated. I always find personally that it's very hard to play the tune from just reading the sheet music. I want to know what it sounds like. I have to hear that. If I know what the tune sounds like, then I can play it quite easily. But straight off the sheet music, I'm not that good now. But there is an interesting thing about how the tunes were written out. I'll just put this back in here. The book is absolutely massive, as you can see, and by looking at the notation, you can tell by the way the music was written that they are trying to portray specific ornamentation in the tunes. Some tunes that I knew already were written completely different in the book. Also, if you're interested in Francis O'Neill and want to know a little bit more about his story, I read this fantastic book written by Ronan O'Driscoll called Chief O'Neill, a Novel. I highly recommend that you read it. I will leave a link down in the description if you want to check it out. I definitely feel that after this video, with a view on how the famine affected music in Ireland, this is a perfect stepping stone for you to read a little bit more about it and how much Francis O'Neill accomplished over his life. But anyway, when you look through those pages of O'Neill's collection, you are seeing the work of survivors. O'Neill built that entire library on the memories of men who had lived through the famine as children or young adults. A name that you see a lot in there is Early. James Early, he was a piper. He was born in Leitrim in 1846, right in the middle of the crisis. He emigrated to the United States and became a key source for O'Neill. He was the vital link back to the pre-famine piping tradition of Connacht. Another one you see is John McFadden. He was born in Mayo around 1847. He was another survivor. He brought the virtuosic Mayo fiddle style with him to Chicago. O'Neill preserved his compositions and playing style, effectively saving them from the silence that fell over Mayo. And this is something that really didn't dawn on me when I looked at this book in the first place. Preserving the style. Like I said, the way the notes are written, you're trying to preserve a specific ornamentation about it. He wasn't just trying to write down the tune to remember the tune. He was trying to show his style of playing the tune. Another one that you see is Patsy Toohey. He was a slightly different case. He was born in the United States to an Irish immigrant family. He became the most famous piper of the vaudeville era. His wax cylinder recordings from the early 20th century preserved a highly ornamented staccato style. It had roots in pre-famine Ireland, but it really flourished in the American theatre. Back in Ireland, the silence began to lift, only with the conscious efforts of the Gaelic revival in the 1890s. This wasn't accidental, it was political. A movement was set in motion to preserve Irish music and the culture as a whole. This acted as a catalyst, building a massive following during the rising years leading up to the 1920s. Douglas Hyde and his contemporaries founded the League in 1893. Their goal was explicit. They wanted to de-Anglicise Ireland. They recognised that the loss of language and music was a colonial trauma that required active reversal. To do this, they organised Fesna. These were festivals designed to encourage Irish speech and music. Then came the Feis Ceoil in 1897. This festival institutionalised the performance of traditional music. It moved the culture from the kitchen to the concert platform. While this did save the music from extinction, it also fundamentally changed it. It sanitised the tradition for a respectable middle-class audience. It was a far cry from the raucous, whiskey-fueled pattern days of the pre-famine era. The Great Silence remains a potent theme in modern Irish art. The trauma hasn't fully resolved. Take Donnacha Dennehy's contemporary work, The Hunger. It integrates the famine writings of Asenath Nicholson with sean-nós singing. Dennehy attempts to give a voice to that silence using the very wail that Petrie described. It presents a modern reckoning with that sonic void. The Great Famine nearly extinguished the auditory soul of Ireland. The Great Silence was total. It was the physical death of the musician. It was the economic death of the patron. It was the crushing silence of the workhouse and the new shame attached to the culture. The music that came out the other side was different. In Ireland, it became quieter and more private. It lost its wildness, but across the Atlantic, the pre-famine energy survived. It was codified by Francis O'Neill and played by the children of the coffin ships. The silence wasn't broken by simply returning to the past. The famine silenced the land, but the diaspora kept the tune. The most profound finding here is that the preservation of this music was an accidental byproduct of the tragedy itself. If the famine hadn't forced that mass exodus to places like Chicago, the regional styles of the mid-19th century might have simply faded under Victorian modernisation. Instead, the disaster froze them in time. The diaspora acted like amber, preserving the music until it could be brought back a century later. So that's it for the video. Thanks very much for watching. If you made it this far, please hit that like button and comment your thoughts down below. I would really like to know what you think about this. For myself, I found it very interesting to research this topic. You do always read about the bits of the famine that's on the surface, the loss of life, the mass emigration, all those tragic stories. They should never be forgotten, but focusing in on the music and the sound can give you a different look at what Ireland was like back then. A unique look at what Ireland was like back then. It's not often that we sit here and try and imagine ourselves walking along an old countryside a few hundred years ago. One of our first natural steps to that is to imagine what we can see. We don't usually think of what we can hear. I really liked the imagery of Ireland before the famine, the busy townlands, music played everywhere, loud, busy, messy, chaotic, especially with the diary from Nicholson before and after the famine, where she compared that she was first met with so much hospitality and she saw life from that lower middle class. But then when she came back a few years later, and it was like the flick of a switch, it was quiet, things were lost. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this, and we can have a chat about it down in the comments. And before we wrap up, I want to give a huge shout out to our channel members. Here's your names up on screen now. Thanks a million for all your support over the last year as always, and your continued support into 2026. I hope you all had a great Christmas and a great New Year's. I want to wish a warm welcome as well to F. Panky and Lily Cosenza. Thanks a million for joining. I'm very glad to have you here along for the journey. And as well as that, don't forget to check out the shop, where I've got a ton of Irish music themed stuff up on there, like hats, hoodies, mugs, and even stuff for your wall as well. If you'd like to see something specific, I can always do custom designs as well. So give a shout out in the comments or drop me an email. But yeah, look, this was the first video of the year. I hope you all enjoyed it. I had great fun making this one. But yeah, anyway, look, I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks a million again for watching. Hope you all have a great day. Slán go fóill. Cheers.